Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Forget the Best, Good and Better Approaches to Preservation. I have just a few housekeeping notes to mention before we get started. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help troubleshoot with you. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with a PDF version of the slideshow, will be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. And finally, we do have some built-in time at the end to answer any questions that may come up, but please feel free to type them into the chat box at any point throughout the presentation. Before I pass this over to our presenter, I just wanted to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York. DHPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. To learn more about our services, please visit DHPSNY.org. And with that, I pass this along to today's presenter, Emilia.
Thank you, Leah. Hello, everyone. My name again is Emilia Emig. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a preservation specialist with the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. I am speaking with you today from the great Iron City of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I'd like to acknowledge that Pittsburgh is built on the traditional ancestral lands of the Shawnee and Osage and other Native peoples who came before us. So today we will be discussing best practices in preservation of collections, though we are not looking to follow best practices to an absolute T. A best practice is not helpful if it's not realistic. Instead, we can take the ideas behind a best practice and make them more usable and practical, particularly for organizations that don't have a ton of resources. I think it's easy to feel frustrated sometimes when we look at our collections and we know that an item would benefit from a level of care that we're just not able to give. At CCAHA, we talk a lot about this in our assessment work with small organizations that don't have a lot of staff or funding at their disposal. Just because you can't meet the same standards as a big organization with a lot of resources doesn't mean that you are being a bad steward of your collection. The goal is not to let the idea of the best prevent you from taking any steps forward. As long as you are focused on improving collections care and making incremental changes, looking at what is good and what is better, you are being a responsible caretaker of your collection and implementing the best practices that you can. Before we get started, a quick note about the organization I work for, the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. Our preservation services staff, of which I am a part, work in the field, providing education programs and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. CCAHA also offers digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing and framing, and more. We are based in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all around the country, and you can learn more about us and what we do at our website, CCAHA.org. So let's get to it. What are best practices and their less glamorous sidekick, standards? Here you see the definitions advanced by the American Alliance of Museums in their Guide to National Standards and Best Practices for U.S. Museums. Standards are generally accepted levels of attainment that museums are expected to achieve. Best practices are commendable actions and philosophies that demonstrate an awareness of standards, successfully solve problems, can be replicated, and that museums may choose to emulate if appropriate to their circumstances. I'll paraphrase here, but AAM also breaks those definitions down into normal language, which is to say, standards are things that all good organizations should do. And if they don't meet those standards, they can be called out for it by their peers, the press, and the public. Best practices then are extra credit, for which an organization should be praised if they can do, but not faulted if they can't. Applying this to collections care, best practices aren't rules or laws, but suggestions of care based on the knowledge of what can harm collections. Best practices can apply to all areas of collections work, from the materials you use to wrap and store your collections, to your environmental management, to your organizational policies. And there can be a big difference between what might be field-wide best practices and what are best practices that are right for your institution. It's important to recognize that finding solutions to preservation problems that fit within your budget, time, and staffing limits is an ongoing issue for most sites. And it's not something that can be solved with a magical one-size-fits-all solution. Now, I know the title of this presentation is Forget the Best, but I don't really advocate for forgetting about the best goals entirely. Best practices represent research and dialogue in our field, and as such, they should be regularly reviewed and revised as that conversation continues. But while we need to recognize what a best practice is, we can go ahead and tuck it in our back pocket. Instead, let's look at preservation as a series of benchmarks that can be broken into smaller tasks or incremental steps, and getting to each step can be considered a success. And using this model, we'll work our way up a staircase or a ladder or whatever upward metaphor you'd like to use. The first step here is getting started. This is the minimal level of care necessary for responsible stewardship. Really, it's what you need to do to get started on caring for your collections. That said, getting started might be the initial step, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily easy or inexpensive. But it is where you have to start. The next step is good, and that's a little bit better than the getting started step, but still with room for improvement. And the third step is better. And in this model, that means we are doing as well as we can right now with the resources we have available. You'll notice there is no best category, and we're moving away from that best idea and acknowledging that there will almost always be room for improvement. And that's also true for institutions with lots of resources. Even they will have areas in which they could do better. So today we will go through some ideas using this model to think about achieving preservation through small benchmarks. I hope that what we'll talk about will encourage you to approach preservation in a more practical way and think a little differently about the idea of a best practice in your daily work. Here's an outline of what we'll look at. We'll dig deeper into the first three topics, which are more object focused. So that's housing and enclosures, storage space, and environmental management. Then we'll move to the bigger picture institutional sections of policy development and planning, and grants and funding. And even though we won't spend a huge amount of time on those last two categories, they are, of course, extremely important. We'll kick things off with housing and enclosures. In a perfect world, maybe all of our storage areas would look like this picture. All materials would be housed in uniform boxes that are made of high quality materials with interior packing that's customized to each object and with everything nicely labeled. But of course, this is not what a lot of our storage areas look like, and that is just fine. As long as we are focused on taking small steps forward and making our way up the ladder, we are doing a good job. In the getting started phase with housing, we want to have items in boxes or some kind of primary enclosure. Almost anything is better than nothing. We'll talk about this in a few places today, but enclosures do all sorts of good things. They add a barrier layer against forces that can harm our collections like water, dust, fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity, and pests. Enclosures also keep objects from moving around or falling off shelves. They can protect the object from the shelf itself, and they keep objects from bumping into and damaging each other. So what kind of options might you have as you're getting started? Cardboard boxes, as most cats like to demonstrate, will do in a pinch. You could also have objects wrapped in plastic sheeting, bubble wrap, or even packing blankets. These should not be thought of as long-term solutions, though, because there is concern about the damage that might come from using these less than ideal materials. But they would give you a basic layer of protection in the short term. Clear plastic bins are another great solution. Sterilite tubs or bins are fairly stable and inert, and often a lot cheaper than archival boxes. You do want to make sure that you aren't creating a microclimate inside of any enclosure, especially if you know or suspect that you have active issues like insects or mold. It's good to use lids or close the top flaps on boxes because that adds more protection and helps to limit overfilling, but you can keep the bins unsealed to allow some airflow. Again, especially when you are using things like a regular cardboard box, be sure to think about it as temporary. You don't want to have your objects in regular cardboard forever. The cardboard will, sooner than later, begin to become very acidic and may cause damage to the artifacts inside, or the box itself may break down and collapse, which creates more problems. However, these materials can be great for temporary storage while you plan and budget for moving up to your next step. And with any material and any style of enclosure, it's super important to monitor your collections on a regular basis. This will hopefully help you to catch any issues in an early stage where you can still do something about it. As you probably know, if you've purchased anything from boxes to shelving for your collection, there are a lot of choices out there. To narrow the field a bit and help us approach the good benchmark, it can help to look at the term archival. In professional conservation and preservation work, archival is used to denote materials that are chemically stable and will not produce harmful byproducts. But the term archival is not officially regulated, and so it carries no true technical meaning in the commercial world. It's a term that is widely used in advertising for preservation supplies and art supplies, and it's often misleading. Knowing what a few other manufacturing terms mean can be more valuable than relying on that catch-all of archival. To very quickly go through this list with some brief definitions. The first term is lignin-free, and lignin is a substance found in all vascular plants. In trees, lignin binds the cellulose fibers together. Lignin does break down and become acidic over time. So anything made of wood, like most paper made since the 19th century, or made of plants, like baskets or textiles, has the potential to become acidic as their lignin breaks down. If a product is marked lignin-free, it means that the lignin has been removed in the manufacturing process, and so the material will not become acidic over time. In the same vein, the term acid-free refers to material that was pH neutral at the time it was made. If you think back to chemistry class, the pH scale runs from 0, very acidic, to 14, very alkaline, with around 7 being considered neutral. Being marked acid-free does not mean that a material will not become acidic over time, because it doesn't tell us whether or not the material has lignin in it. Acid-free means that the material was tested and determined to have a neutral pH at the time it was made. One convenient way you can check the acidity of a box or a folder you're using is with what's known as a pH testing pen. There are a few styles of pH pens available, and you can use them to draw a line on the housing material that you're curious about. You want to pick a discrete spot to test, and the color will change depending on the acidity. pH pens can be obtained fairly cheaply, usually for around $10, and can save you a lot of questioning. The next term is buffered, and you'll want to use buffered or unbuffered materials depending on the type of artifacts you're storing. Buffered materials have had an alkaline reserve, usually around 2% or 3% calcium carbonate, added during their manufacture. This is the buffer which gives the housing material an alkaline pH. The alkaline reserve works to counteract that lignin breakdown and the acid that might develop in paper products, and it also protects against acidic pollutants in the environment. However, this added alkaline reserve can be depleted over time, and the housing material may still become acidic in the future. So buffered materials will still need to be replaced at some point. They just extend the lifetime that the housing materials are useful. And there are some collection materials which can be very sensitive to the alkaline reserve in buffered materials. Generally, the advice is to avoid using buffered products with objects that have protein-based materials like silk or wool textiles, as it causes other chemical reactions that we don't want. If you are in doubt about what to use, it's safe to go with unbuffered materials. The Photographic Activity Test, or PAT, is an important standard for housing photographs. This is a test that was developed by the Image Permanence Institute, and it explores the interactions between photographic images and the enclosures in which they are stored. The PAT is routinely used to test papers, adhesives, inks, glass and framing components, sleeving materials, labels, photo albums, and more. Products which have passed the PAT will generally have this labeled in their material specifications sheet. It is really essential that materials used to house or store photos have this designation. And lastly, you see what we can call the big 3 Ps of plastics. There are many types of clear plastic enclosures, and they can all look fairly similar to the naked eye. To ensure that you are using stable, good quality enclosures that will not harm photos, documents, and other paper-based materials, look for either polyester, polyethylene, or polypropylene. A 4th P, polyvinyl chloride, or PVC, is an inherently unstable plastic and should not be used around collections. Thanks for bearing with me through all of that. I know it's a lot, but these are some of the most often used and most important terms to consider when you're shopping for storage supplies. So in a better step, we're making systematic purchases of supplies. We're being mindful of those terms we just talked about and choosing archival quality products whenever we can. In reality, it can be difficult and costly to use all archival materials all of the time, and so it's not always a practical goal. Not everything has to be of the best archival quality, but the materials that are in direct contact with an artifact should be when you can manage it. You don't have to order everything from the specialized archival supply vendors either. Other places may offer good quality supplies. It's smart to check the product descriptions and contact the manufacturer if something is not stated or is unclear. Really, you should be doing this even for products that come from those specialty vendors. Just because something is in an archival catalog does not mean that it is actually archival. This goes for other supplies too, like gloves, cloths, brushes, and storage furniture. And keep in mind that for many suppliers, the price points often drop as the number in order increases. So you may want to see if other institutions in your area would like to join forces when you place an order. I also wanted to mention the inclusive vendor list that we've developed at CCAHA, which might be of interest as you are thinking about where to spend your organization's money. This list is something that came out of a colloquium on diversity in collections care that CCAHA held in 2021. The list is a work in progress, but we hope it will raise awareness for small businesses, particularly those that are BIPOC, LGBTQ+, and women-owned and/or operated, as well as businesses that offer sustainable products. And another step in the better category, you may be taking the interior packing up another level by using your intentionally purchased supplies to create customized housing solutions. You could be either retrofitting the interiors of pre-made boxes to nicely cushion and support your artifacts, or even making your own boxes to provide a customized home for an object. An awesome resource for inspiration and information on how to create custom housing is Stash C, which stands for Storage Techniques for Art, Science, and History Collections. For more ideas about customized storage and more tips and tricks about lower cost but still appropriate archival materials, take a look at their website. In addition to Stash C, there are lots of resources available online to guide you in selecting materials and supplies and creating enclosures. Not necessarily going in order here, but the American Institute for Conservation's wiki site, the Cameo project through the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, and the Society for the Preservation of Natural History Collections wiki are fantastic places to get information on specific materials that are commonly used for storage and preservation. Connecting to Collections Care is another absolutely amazing resource. This is an online community of the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation that is free for anyone to join, and it offers email listservs, webinars, courses, and other resources for caring for collections, and much of it is free of charge. And they do a really nice job at keeping information understandable for those of us who aren't professional conservators or may not have a lot of experience with different kinds of collections. Both DHPSNY and CCAHA, as well as our colleagues at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, offer resources through our websites on all sorts of preservation topics. And the National Park Service also has some really great resources, including their famous conservograms, which are short bulletins on a huge variety of preservation topics. All right, moving on to a crowded topic for a lot of organizations, storage space. Once you have your collections in the proper housing and enclosures, what do you do with them? How do you make space for them? Having enough of your own secure, climate-controlled space for storing collections, both in terms of your current holdings and future growth, is a very common problem for collecting organizations. And if you are struggling with this issue, you are definitely not alone. This is a good example of the first step not always being the easiest. But try not to feel overwhelmed by this list, and remember to think about how you can break things down into those smaller tasks. It is very difficult to do any sort of space planning without knowing what you have. When you are getting started here, you want to have a good handle on the specific needs of the collections and what is available to you in terms of both furniture and space. Pulling this information together requires time, which is another valuable resource, but it is so crucial to the success of your planning and your end results. For the collections, having something like a collections development policy can help you determine if there are items in your collection that fall outside of your collecting scope and are therefore candidates for removal or deaccessioning. Of course, deaccessioning should not be your primary or your only way to make space, but it is certainly something to keep in mind. You always want to be using your resources like space wisely. It's also important to consider some of the other factors listed here, as they might affect how and where your collections should be stored. There might not be a whole lot you can do right away to tackle all of this, but you can reach the getting started benchmark by knowing your collections and what kind of shelving and space is available to you. How many of you have a storage room that looks like the image on the left or something close to it? If you don't, pat yourself on the back because many places do. Another way to approach storage space is to take it one room or closet at a time. The photos here show the before and after of a reorganization and space saving project at the Wharton Esherick Museum in Malvern, Pennsylvania. The museum was overwhelmed with the thought of comprehensive space planning, so decided instead to move in small steps, starting with this closet. They looked at all the collections in the closet and determined which pieces fit into the collecting scope. They had lots of non-collections materials in this area, so they were able to discard a lot. And that's another fun getting started tip. If it's not part of the collection, get it out of your collection storage. It may be a challenge, but it's necessary. If at all possible, find another spot for things like holiday decorations or old office furniture that has been added to collection storage. Back to this example, the museum made sure everything was housed properly, following many of the steps we've already talked about. And then they were able to use the space more appropriately. Of course, this required thought, staff time, and elbow grease, but in terms of other costs, it wasn't an expensive project. The museum used discarded boxes from a neighboring historic site. They had help from interns and volunteers from a local museum studies program, and the project was led by their own staff. There are definitely still some issues here. Boxes are still sitting on the floor, for example, but overall, this is a big improvement and a fantastic job. Well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with going room by room or another smaller way that is doable for your site. There are resources out there that can guide you through the storage organization process with more of a bird's eye view. One of those resources is REORG, which is a partnership between the International Center for the Study of the Preservation and Restoration of Cultural Property, or ICROM, and the Canadian Conservation Institute. REORG is a method for planning and implementing a storage reorganization project, and it includes a self-evaluation of your storage spaces and assists you in coming up with a logical approach to reorganization. REORG takes you step by step through the process, and it's a great and free resource. So in the getting started step of storage, it's about evaluating what you have and what is available to you. When we move up to the good benchmark, it might be adapting storage furniture that is already on hand to meet your needs and to fit into the spaces you have. You still want to make sure you're going about this in a way that is good for the collection. In the image on the left, we see a not so good adaptation of available storage furniture. It's less the locker itself than the way the items are filling it. There could be a good way to use this locker for collections, maybe stacking boxes on top of one another inside of it, for example. On the right, a better example of adaptation. This institution took some old library bookshelves, pushed them back to back with each other, and used them to house oversized portfolios. Everything is stacked soundly, not too high, and with like-sized books supporting each other or larger sizes on the bottom, and nothing is leaning or on an angle. You can see everything more easily as well, which helps with access, and that's a huge win, not having to handle multiple items to get to the one you need. It's a really nice use of some old furniture. And you can do the same thing with historic furniture that might also be on display in your historic house museum, for example. These are photos again from our friends at the Wharton Esherick Museum. Wharton Esherick, the man, was an artist and a woodworker. And there are some unique storage items around his house, which is now the museum. Since space is limited, it would be a shame to leave these spaces empty. So the clever staff at the museum made responsible use of them. They made sure to have a safe buffer or barrier layer between the collection stored in the cabinets and the cabinets themselves. As we discussed earlier in the housing section, having a layer between the object itself and the potentially harmful outside world is helpful. And when dealing with wood, which has that lignin in it and can be highly acidic, it's important to keep that acid away from the artifacts. This can be done by either putting your object in an enclosure and then putting that inside of the wooden cabinet, or by lining the cabinet with a layer of archival quality board, plastic, or foam that can help absorb that acid before it makes its way to the artifact. The next step from adapting what you already have would be creating or purchasing what you need. The picture on the left shows some lovely hanging screens in Cooperstown at the Hall of Fame. And in the center image, you see some cool rolled textile storage at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art. This step certainly doesn't mean that you have to buy these lovely hanging screens and fancy compact shelving units from vendors that cater to the cultural heritage community. Here again, you can look at hardware stores and elsewhere to see what might be less expensive and still of good quality for storage. You can also purchase materials for constructing things yourself if you, your staff, or even friends of your site have those skills. It's important to keep in mind that certain materials, surfaces, and sealants are more suitable than others for preservation. And there are good resources available to give you more information on products to look for and products to avoid. It's also helpful to have that information handy when you're evaluating your existing furniture and thinking about which of your options are of better quality or could be more easily adapted. This idea of adapting and creating infrastructure for your site works beyond shelving. The picture on the right shows a cart that the Philadelphia Athenaeum created to help safely navigate their very narrow storage aisles with the large architectural blueprints that they have. Okay, so environmental management. And for our purposes, this includes temperature and relative humidity, light and pests. It's obviously a really big topic, and we'll just graze the surface today with some smaller benchmarks in mind. But here again, there are a lot of great resources out there if you want to get more information on a particular segment. We're all probably familiar with the best practices advanced for environmental management for the climate of mixed collections. That includes maintaining temps of 59 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 to 55% relative humidity in collection spaces. For light levels, that means the ultraviolet or UV radiation is filtered and eliminated from your light sources. And visible light is kept at recommended levels and durations for the type of objects on view. And it means your organization has an active integrated pest management plan that uses a holistic approach and controlled measures to prevent, reduce, or eliminate pests in your collection and your facility. Similarly to how we got started in our last section on space planning, it's important to know what you're dealing with in environmental conditions. So the first benchmark can simply be that, monitoring your space and getting a baseline of data. For capturing temperature and relative humidity, this can include purchasing data loggers. Data loggers, as you are probably familiar, are electronic devices that record temperature and relative humidity and transmit that information to a computer. Data loggers can be pretty inexpensive and simple to use. At CCAHA, we've put together a quick comparison chart of various types of data loggers, and that's a helpful place to start your research. We often work with institutions who are not doing any environmental monitoring at all because they think there's nothing they can do to change their situation. That may be true somewhat, but even if, for example, mechanical climate control is limited or impossible in your collection space, monitoring is still important. Being armed with that data can help you to better advocate for your board or management for improvements like a new HVAC system or a new collection storage facility. And for many grant applications, having this information will help to support your request. You may also be surprised when you monitor to find that some areas of your building have a more stable climate than others and are therefore better places to store collections. Light monitoring is a bit trickier, but you probably already know where and when you have too much light coming into your buildings. Here again, capturing and writing down that data will be beneficial and help you to make decisions. As far as tools to help you monitor, you can purchase things like the textile fading cards seen on the left. They're also called blue wool standards or blue scales, and leave them out to see how light might be affecting your artifacts. When using these, you can either have two cards, one of which is your control card that's kept in darkness, and the other is used in the area you're monitoring. Or you can cover one half of the card with aluminum foil or another strong material that blocks the light and creates that control side. An inexpensive way to mimic that is to use colored construction paper, which you can cut into strips and place around your storage area. Again, keeping one side in darkness by covering it in foil. Don't forget to label which monitor is where. And a few weeks later, take them out and compare. You might see that some areas naturally stay darker than others and are better for storage. In any areas where you're seeing noticeable fading, remember that light damage is cumulative and irreversible. So make sure your artifacts are covered and protected from that light as much as possible. The same thing goes with pests. it's most helpful to know which bugs are problems for you before you try to do anything about it. Monitoring pests is often something that institutions contract out to pest control vendors, and that is great. It's part of the better step that we'll get to in a minute. Doing pest monitoring yourself is not hard or expensive, and it can be a helpful first step to getting a handle on your situation before you pay for that contracted service. And internal monitoring should continue even after you have a service in place. Many archival supply vendors sell pest monitoring kits like the one pictured on the right, which is available from Hollinger Metal Edge for about $150. A kit like this makes it easy and would have you set for a while. You could also build your own kit using this as a guideline. In addition to visual monitoring, it's super helpful to use sticky traps to help us catch those sneaky little critters who are so good at hiding. The smaller image above our waving friend there shows a sticky trap, which is also called a blunder trap because the pests can blunder or stumble right into them. Remember to monitor traps and change them out quarterly or as needed. You want them to actually be sticky and not filled with dust. Also change the traps as soon as they capture any victims and you've made a note or snapped a photo of what was caught. Museumpests.net and Insects Unlimited are two delightfully creepy crawly websites to help you identify common pests that invade collections. Once you know what kind of pests you have and where and why they might be getting into your space, then you can start taking more targeted action. For pests, another key getting started step is to put things in boxes. Remember that boxes will give pests one more layer to have to get through before they reach the artifacts and start causing real damage. And again, boxes block light and help protect against fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity. So you're giving your artifacts a little bit of protection, even if your environment is not well controlled. So where you can, box it up, and you'll get this first step of preservation crossed off. The preservation impact of a stable environment cannot be overstated. Extremes and fluctuations in temperature and relative humidity can cause irreversible damage in many materials. Keeping things stable is more important than staying at a set point or within a narrow range. The damage from temperature and relative humidity comes when they are wildly changing back and forth over long stretches of time. So we are better off spending our efforts to keep things stable. You'd be surprised at what is possible with just a fan to circulate air. Maybe using data loggers, you can see what might be the best times of day to turn on and off fans to help you keep things stable. Standalone dehumidifiers and humidifiers are also quite helpful. And you might be familiar with this from your own home, but a low-tech way to bring the humidity up in a room without a humidifier is to put bowls of water near baseboard vents to allow moisture to evaporate and raise that humidity. It might sound a little in bad taste to keep a bowl of water sitting out around your collections, but having really dry conditions is also not good for collections. The risk of someone kicking over a small bowl of water might be worth it if we can raise that humidity a little, particularly in the dry months that we have in the winter in some parts of the country. The key is, with any measures, we want to actively monitor, make sure the fans are secure and not causing artifacts to move. Make sure the dehumidifiers are emptied when needed. As always, keep an eye on things. So for light exposure, the best offense is a good defense. Block the light however you can. This can be as simple as adding curtains to windows, as you see here. But if it's storage or another space that's not seen by the public, you can use what you have. A piece of board will do. Adding UV filtering to windows and bulbs is actually not that expensive, but the film can be tricky to install on the windows. And the film does break down over time and will need to be replaced. Often 8 to 10 years is the figure that's put out there. So you do need to monitor UV film and watch for signs of cracking and aging. It might just be easier to block off a window entirely with a secure but still removable cover. If that's not an option, or if you can reduce exposure by covering the artifacts themselves, placing them in a box or an enclosure, or if they're too large for that, you can drape them with a muslin sheet. Also remember the basics. Keep shades and curtains closed in inactive spaces and turn off the lights when they're not in use. For pests, block what you can is also a great approach. Make sure your doors and your windows are well sealed. Repair broken windows and replace damaged insulation promptly, and keep windows and doors closed and locked. This will not only help to keep out pests, but will also benefit temperature and humidity regulation and improve security. Also, once you know what kind of pests are getting in, you can plot how to block those pests. Maybe they're coming in at a certain part of your building that you can shore up. And you can use traps that work best for the particular type of critter. Pest infestations are expensive, so it's best not to have them in the first place. So unfortunately, there are no real cheap solutions here. Nothing can really replace having a good HVAC system. This type of cost is a perfect example of why it's advisable for an institution to, one, have a cyclical maintenance plan that helps you plan and budget for repairs and upgrades, and two, to create a sinking fund or a savings account and have a reserve of funds. You can use those funds for bigger expenditures like this, maintenance projects, or even an emergency. On any system, whether old or new, doing upkeep is important. Change filters regularly, quarterly, or as indicated, and use the correct type of filter for your system. Make sure the system is serviced at least once a year. Getting a service contract in place so that you don't have to scramble to identify a vendor when you have a malfunction or a breakdown is also a good thing. Remember to keep track of your warranty information and take advantage of services that are covered under warranty. When you're on a shoestring budget, every bit of that counts. So this image shows a new HVAC unit that was installed in 2021 at a museum in Washington State. The museum had posted this image on their website, and they said they were able to make this upgrade through funding generated from memberships, donations, shop sales, and other activities. It may not be the most glamorous of things to talk about, but it's a big achievement for the museum and something that is very relatable for many visitors. It reminds folks that your site has ongoing operational needs that they can help support. For light, a really achievable goal for the better category is switching to LED lighting. Most importantly for our collections, LEDs emit little to no heat or UV. LEDs are more efficient in energy usage, and the bulbs last longer than other types of bulbs, so you'll spend less in replacement. The traditional warning is that there's more cost up front to make the switch to LEDs, but it is certainly an investment that will pay off in the long run. So in addition to the preservation angle, you can usually make a good argument on the cost savings angle of LEDs to the board or management. And then to bring this section full circle, as we looked at earlier, having a contract in place with a pest management company is a really great thing to do, but it has to be done correctly. In this better step, you would have a contract with a pest company that is familiar with cultural organizations and with your site. Unfortunately, it's common for institutions to not really communicate with their contractors about what they're finding, what that means, and what treatments are being used. So they don't really get a full understanding of the issues. We don't want the pest control to be a waste of money or worse, problematic for your site. So communication is important. Speak with your pest control rep regularly about what pests the company finds at your site, and make sure the treatments they're using will not harm your collections, staff, and grounds. Pest control vendors can set up a system for inspections, outside spraying, and bait or traps that don't use harmful chemicals. But the key is to not let this become a set it and forget it part of your operations. It should be an active part of your collections care and your integrated pest management efforts. And I have to say, these images show the best kind of pests to have in a museum, dead ones, all in the collection of the Smithsonian. So moving on to institutional management, and the things we'll talk about in this section are policies and preservation-related planning. So the best practices here are that we would regularly conduct assessments of collections care issues, and we would have all collections-related policies in writing, formally approved by the governing body of the institution, and subject to regular review and update. What else can be done if you're not quite there yet? Having an assessment done is an awesome getting started measure because assessments will do just that, help you get started. Assessments can help you identify and prioritize tasks, provide resources, and guide you in the steps needed to make that work happen. Some assessments are free or have low costs, and you can often get grant funding for preservation needs assessments or risk assessments. And some assessments have outside assessors involved, while others are in a self-guided format. Here's a list of places to start. Just to briefly roll through a few of these, starting with the Preservation Self-Assessment Program from the University of Illinois. That is a free self-guided online tool that helps staff prioritize efforts to improve conditions of collections. CAP, which stands for Collections Assessment for Preservation, is a program aimed at small to mid-sized institutions, and it usually involves both a collections assessor who offers tips and recommendations for caring for your collections, and a building assessor who looks at your buildings from a preservation standpoint. MAP is the museum assessment program run through AAM, and it has several different tracks, including a collections stewardship option. If you're a New York institution, there is, of course, the fantastic DHPSNY program and its assessments. And for anyone tuning in not from a New York site, CCAHA also provides a variety of assessment services. So when you're starting small with policy development, you can first look at what you're currently doing. Chances are that you've already got some policies and plans in action. For example, you might be doing housekeeping on a regular basis, but you don't have a written policy in place. Policies are important for consistency. Just write down what you're doing, even if it's not formally approved or adopted. Having some record of the way that you do things is helpful for training, for preserving institutional memory, as well as for your future policy development. Here again, there are tools out there to help you. There are several resources for emergency planning. You might already be familiar with the Pocket Response Plan from the Council of State Archivists, which is a template that you fill out with information to help your site in the event of an emergency or a disaster. There's also DPlan, an online disaster planning tool from the Northeast Document Conservation Center. My organization, CCAHA, is currently developing a fantastic resource that will guide sites in creating a collections management policy. Our CMP toolkit is slated to launch later this year, so please keep an eye on CCAHA's website and social media for updates on that. Also, we definitely encourage organizations to work together on policy development. It helps to have friends and colleagues who are in the same boat, so you can share tips and resources for getting your document ducks in a row. You don't have to reinvent the wheel here either. Borrow from other policies that use language, structure, and ideas that you like. But for any document, always make sure that it stays focused on your site and is tailored to your mission and collections. For a better step with policies, ideally an organization would have in place the most significant policy and planning documents for the type of site that it is, whether that's an archive, library, museum, etc. The documents you see listed here come from AAM, American Alliance of Museums. AAM has designated these 5 items as core documents because they are fundamental for professional museum operations, and they embody core museum values and practices, as AAM puts it. And of course, these can be considered core documents for sites that aren't museums too. There are many additional policies and plans that a collecting organization can and should have, but these are a skilled starting 5. They cover a lot of ground and give you important guidelines and support for your daily work. AAM has a section on its website that goes deeper into these documents and what they mean and what they should do for an organization. So that's a very helpful resource. And for our last section today, that wonderful stuff that makes the world go around, money. Funding for preservation is another massive topic, and we're only going to take a super quick look at a few angles. Again, thinking about how to make incremental improvements. Best practice here would be that your department or organization has a line item in the budget that's dedicated to preservation, including supplies and training and even conservation treatment. And also that you're regularly applying for grant funding to support collections care initiatives. Getting rolling can be a challenge here. You might have only one choice to get started, and that's to work with the budget you have. Having a dedicated line item for preservation funding is fantastic, but we know it's not always possible. However, this is something that's definitely worth advocating for. A preservation budget, whether that's a line item or a dedicated fund or account, is looked upon well by funders, and it does increase the value of preservation institution-wide. And having that regularly allocated funding stream can go a long way to ensuring the long-term health of your collection. So this one is worth fighting for. Another great step at the getting started stage is to be ready with your wish list. Have a running list of supplies, equipment, training opportunities, and other resources that you need for collections care, and prioritize things so that if money ever lands in your lap, you're prepared. Funding opportunities from donors and friends of the organization can happen suddenly, and having your list at the ready will save time. And the same goes for grant funding. Sometimes grants will pop up that have relatively short timelines. So keep your wish list at the ready. One strategy that's often used, and I personally like very much, is for a site to have their wish list broken down by cost levels and specific types of items that will be funded, with a brief description of what the items will do for the organization. That helps make it easier to pair a donation amount with items that are most helpful, and it clearly shows a donor that you have thought and intent behind this request. For another good step, and this is mostly referring to grant funding, but can also apply to individual donors or other civic groups, consider looking locally for funding sources. Often smaller foundations and other local bodies like chambers of commerce or historic preservation groups will prefer to support organizations within their city or region. The images here show some porch repairs that happened at historic Sugartown, also in Malvern, Pennsylvania, using funds from the Pennsylvania Historical Museums Commission, which is our state historical organization. Sometimes these local grant opportunities may be less complex and less competitive in comparison to the national programs. So if you have not ever applied for a grant before, you might consider starting by looking on the local level. That said, don't be afraid to go for the big national awards. Even if you're coming from a small organization, these funders also want to help you. There are certain grant categories just for small and mid-sized organizations, particularly the NEH Preservation Assistant Grants and the IMLS Inspire Grants. So you don't have to worry that you're competing against mega museums and libraries. CCAHA has worked on many NEH Preservation Assistance grants. The applications are typically due in January and fund projects up to $10,000 with no matching funds required on your part. So it's a fantastic opportunity. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for sharing your time today. I wish all of you a safe and healthy rest of the winter. My email is listed here. If you have questions or want to drop me a note later on, please do. I am happy to help connect you with resources however I can. And if there are any questions or comments, we could take a look at those now. And if not, that's okay too. Everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Let's just give folks a second to see sometimes it takes a little while to type in their questions. Okay, we have our first question. If you have no air conditioning, what would you suggest for a storage space solution?
That's a good question, and that's a very common situation, right? Especially in historic buildings that weren't designed with central mechanical HVAC systems. Fans are a good option there. Again, you need to keep an eye on them, make sure they're not positioned and blowing on, making artifacts move. Make sure the wires are secure, especially if they're in a place where you're working. But fans can actually do a good bit to get you some air circulation. Sometimes, especially in historic homes and old buildings, just opening the windows and doors for short amounts of time on a nice hot day can create some airflow, sort of using the house in the way that it was intended to be cooled. So if it's a historic space like that might be an option. Again, it has to be done while you're there and monitoring and controlled, keeping an eye on everything. But sometimes there are ways to facilitate some airflow like that. If you have windows, a window air conditioning unit goes a long way to helping stabilize things. They also make standalone units that could add some airflow and some cooling. So if you can add one of those, that might be an option for you. I hope that helps.
And our next question, is foam always inert to use in storage?
I guess my short answer would be not all foam, no, but there are certain types of foam that are more inert, more acceptable to use. There's a great resource from the National Park Service that lists some good foam, including other materials, good plastics that are considered more appropriate to use in storage situations. So, again, it goes to looking for some of those terms we talked about and checking to make sure that you're getting your supplies from a reputable vendor and you're keeping an eye on things and monitoring them after the fact. So in the resource list that we can send out, there is a really great list from the National Park Service that can guide you in the choice of some of those appropriate foam selections. I hope that helps.
Our next question is from a private collector who uses plastic storage lockers, and they are wondering if there's any issue with using plastic storage units.
For sure, that's a good question, and that's another common issue, I think. Using old wood and old plastic storage units it's not ideal. It's not what we would do if we had all the money and resources in the world, but it's not necessarily a bad option. Again, in that case, you really want to make sure when you have a plastic storage unit that you're keeping your items in enclosures, keeping them in boxes, not letting them sit directly on the plastic. Another good thing to do is to line those shelves with archival board, archival foam like a Velara, even acrylic sheeting, something that can help create a buffer between the plastic shelf and the enclosure, or if it's a larger object, itself. It's not ideal, but if you can adapt it with one of those two ways, it's certainly suitable for a short to mid-term range. If you can, start planning for some new furniture that could, that is more appropriate and could allow you to get rid of those plastic units. I hope that helps.
Do you have good and better practices for mold cases? My institution doesn't have the ability to buy a fridge in case of outbreak.
Boy, that's an excellent question. Not being able to buy a fridge is not the end of the world. It's certainly something, if you have other institutions in your area, larger institutions that do have those resources, it might be good to start identifying a few friends that you could turn to if you ever encountered an outbreak. For mold, it's about preventing the growth, right? So keeping your climate stable, keeping your humidity below 60% goes a long way to preventing that problem before it happens, which is certainly our goal. But it is a good thing to start planning for, to identify a space that you could use to isolate items if you think or you have a mold outbreak that happens. Identifying a space to isolate the items, and identifying a space, offsite if you're able to find someone with a fridge that could help in the short term. I hope that helps.
There are a couple of folks in the chat asking if this is being recorded. So I do just want to reiterate that this has been recorded, and everyone who is registered for the program, which of course includes everyone who is here with us today, will be receiving a link to this recording as well as a PDF version of the slideshow. That email will be sent out within the next week or so. And the next question: for old and fragile rare books that will occasionally be handled for research, is a phase box or a clamshell with buffered paper as a pillow a better choice?
Boy, these are good questions. For an old and fragile rare book, if it's occasionally being handled for research, whatever you can do to facilitate that safe handling, so that's encouraging safe handling practices, that's encouraging the use of clean and dry hands. I think a clamshell with some tissue paper wrapping it is certainly a fine choice. I don't know that it's necessarily an either or there. I think whatever works most comfortably for the condition of the book should be considered first. Then second, for your use and access, depending on how large it is too, you can keep something like that in mind. All of your choices on materials should really be guided by the object itself, right? The condition, the size, the use, the materials, let the object help guide you in that. There are certainly a couple of different combinations that might be helpful, but base it on the conditions of your site and how much the book is used. But I think really either one of those would be a reasonable choice. I hope that helps.
Can I line wooden shelves in a closet to store documents?
For sure. Similar to the question we had about plastic shelving units, that's very common. Old wood shelving units are common. They were more cheaply and widely available. They're usually cheaper than a nice metal option, which is what's sort of advocated in the best practices. With wood, again, it's about keeping your items in enclosures, keeping an eye on them. Wood will off gas throughout its life, its entire life. Even if it's already treated or painted, it continues to off gas to some degree. So you want to make sure your items are in enclosures. If you can, line the shelves, again, with an archival board, an archival foam. If it is an untreated wood, or even if it has maybe some old paint or an old lacquer on it, typically the advice is to add 2 layers of safe approved paint and lacquer, and there are some good choices. The Minnesota Historical Society has put together a good list of some resources on that, and the National Park Service as well, to help guide you to make choices in good paint and good lacquers that can seal the wood, typically 2 coats, and you want to allow 3 to 4 weeks at least for the new material to off gas before you bring the objects back into the space. So I hope that helps, but it is definitely about creating some kind of buffer with wood.
Would environmental monitoring, in the face of thinking there's nothing that can be done, be good for thinking about ways to address the problem by replacing housing more often, or methods other than just throwing a new HVAC system at it?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it's hard with an HVAC system. There's nothing that can sort of match that. But if that's not, an option for you, if you don't see that as a possibility, or even if it might be, regardless, you want to get that baseline of data. You want to monitor. There are passive measures that you can explore to try to help stabilize things and get things in a sort of a better range, a better place. Particularly if you have an area that has a lot of humidity, a lot of high temperatures, and then fluctuations that swing back low to low humidity in the winter. Getting that baseline of data is never a bad thing. It can help advocate for a lot of things that can help. So I think, yes, that is a good question. I hope that helps.
Is there a good and better for collection security as it pertains to preservation?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Is there a good and better for collection security as it pertains to preservation?
So security is, that's a good question. Security is, everyone's job. First of all staff should be involved in your security. If you don't have, best practices would be things like cameras, right? And human security guards on the premises 24 hours a day with controlled key procedures and registers when you're accessing a collection space. If you can't afford sort of the bells and whistles, and if that's not you're not able to jump to that level, starting small by things like making a list of who has the keys and who has access to these spaces, creating a log that staff sign in to say, I was in the storage unit, on this date and time. That just helps create a tracking system in case there are questions later on, or something, unfortunately does go missing, or that there's an incident. You can start small with sort of recording the policies that you're doing, or creating ones that are sort of low cost like that, just starting to keep an eye on things. If you have volunteers or interns or whatever your staffing situation is in your exhibit areas, you want to make sure you have someone with your visitors, just sort of keeping an eye and being a presence in that space. In your storage areas in particular, I could think of a few good options, controlling the access to storage. And if you have researchers or you have other members of the public who come in and want to see your collections or work with your collections in some capacity, making sure that you go over handling guidelines with them, making sure you have gloves ready for them and a clean and safe workspace for them to spread the materials out, talking with them about why we want them to have clean and dry hands when they're using these paper materials, but why we would ask them to wear gloves if they're handling something like a photograph or a metal object where your fingerprints and the oils from your skin are more harmful to the object, as a good opportunity to sort of sneak in some of those preservation conversations with your visitors. But there are definitely things that you could do that are low cost to help you start tracking your security procedures. And again, it really is everyone's responsibility across the organization. I hope that helps.
Would exposed rigid board insulation off gas into a collections area?
I don't know the specific answer to that. I think my first thought would be almost anything can off gas. So it seems certainly a good possibility. I can make some inquiries and do some digging and get back to you. I think, Gary, that was your question, but I would think any material can certainly has the potential for off gassing, which is why if we can, we start to plan and budget to control the types of materials that are used in our storage, in our enclosures, even in our exhibit fabrication, controlling all of the materials that we can that are around our objects on that sort of smaller level. But I'm happy to do some more digging on that. I hope that helps in the meantime.
And it looks like this is our last question. Should tissue paper cushioning old books in storage boxes be changed regularly?
I guess my answer would be let the condition of the tissue sort of dictate that. If it's something that you're handling often, or if it's a piece that you use a lot in your exhibit, so you're getting it out of storage often and unpacking it and then repacking it, you want to make sure the tissue stays clean and is doing its job, right? So if you have things that start to tear, or if your book is starting to crumble and create some some debris in the tissue, make sure you check it thoroughly, of course, but change it out so that it stays clean and good and is doing its job to create that barrier level. So I would say let the condition of your use and your access sort of guide that. But if it's something that's sitting in storage, you don't necessarily have to change the tissue on a routine schedule. Everything starts to wear and break down eventually. So you could plan to do that every, 8 to 10 years, let's say, but keep an eye on how much you use it. I hope that helps.
Okay, and as I said, that was our last question. So I would like to thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Emilia, for such a wonderful presentation. If you enjoyed today's presentation and would like to learn more about our other educational offerings, please check out dhpsny.org/education. Thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.